All right, counselor. Let's see who you really are.
I suggest you read it very carefully, officer.
The day had started, as most of Sarah Jenkins's days did, in a state of controlled chaos. At 7:45 a.m., the kitchen was a whirlwind of toasted bread, spilled orange juice, and the frantic search for a missing homework folder that was inevitably sitting in plain sight on the kitchen counter. Sarah, dressed in a sharply pressed navy blue blazer and tailored slacks, managed the morning ballet with the practiced ease of a seasoned conductor. She was a mother first, a professional second, and the two roles often bled into one another in a frantic, coffee-fueled symphony. Her briefcase, heavy with depositions and legal briefs for a complex racketeering case, sat by the door, a silent testament to the life that awaited her after the school run. The drive to Northwood Preparatory Academy was usually a 15-minute straight shot, a brief window of peace where she could mentally transition from mom to counselor. But this morning, traffic was snarled due to a minor fender bender, and the clock was ticking with malevolent glee. She was due in a meeting with the district attorney at 9 a.m. sharp. There was no room for error. She took a detour, a winding side street she usually avoided. It was quiet, lined with old oak trees and stately brick houses. The speed limit was a sluggish 25 miles per hour. Sarah kept her silver sedan meticulously at 24, her eyes darting between the road and the digital clock on her dashboard. 8:16 a.m. She could still make it. As she approached a four-way stop, she did what thousands of hurried drivers do every day. She slowed, saw no cross-traffic from any direction, and performed a slow, rolling turn, a California stop. It was a minor, almost universal infraction, the kind of thing that rarely, if ever, drew notice. But as she straightened the wheel and accelerated smoothly down the next block, a flash of red and blue erupted in her rearview mirror. Her stomach clenched. Of all the days, of all the insignificant missteps, this was the one that got flagged. With a sigh of resignation, Sarah signaled, pulled her car over to the curb, and killed the engine. The piercing wail of the siren died, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. She glanced in the mirror. A black and white police cruiser loomed behind her, its light bar still pulsing like a predatory heartbeat. The driver's side door of the cruiser opened, and an officer emerged. He was young, no older than 35, with a chiseled jaw and the kind of rigidly confident posture that spoke of military training or an overdeveloped ego. His sunglasses were mirrored, making his face an impenetrable mask. He didn't just walk toward her car, he stalked it. He placed a hand on the trunk as he passed, a standard procedure to leave fingerprints, but his touch seemed proprietary, a gesture of ownership. Instead of approaching her window directly, he stopped at the rear passenger side, forcing her to crane her neck to see him, putting her at an immediate physical disadvantage. This wasn't the body language of an officer writing a simple traffic ticket. This was the posture of a man preparing for a confrontation. Sarah's internal alarm, the one honed by years of cross-examining hostile witnesses, began to ring. She placed her hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, her fingers spread. She knew the script. This was a performance, and her role was to be non-threatening, compliant, and calm. A sharp rap on her window made her jump. "Roll your window all the way down," a voice commanded, laced with an impatient, authoritative edge. Sarah complied, the electric motor humming as the glass disappeared into the door. The officer leaned down, and the scent of cheap, pine-scented air freshener and chewing gum filled her car. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any courtesy. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't state the reason for the stop. He just issued a command. Sarah met his gaze in the side mirror. She could see his nameplate, M. Cutler. She filed the name away. She noted the small black body camera clipped to his uniform, its tiny green light confirming it was active. Good. "Certainly, officer," Sarah said, her voice steady and even, the practiced cadence of a woman who commanded courtrooms for a living. My license is in my wallet, inside my purse on the passenger seat. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, very slowly. Is that acceptable to you? The question was a courtesy, but also a test. It was a de-escalation technique, narrating her movements for his safety and her own. Cutler sneered, a small, ugly twist of his lips. Just get them. Don't need a play-by-play. The casual disrespect was a clear signal. He wasn't interested in procedure, he was interested in dominance. He had already cast her in a role in his mind, another entitled suburbanite in a fancy car who thought the rules didn't apply to her. He had no idea who was sitting in the driver's seat. He had no idea that the woman he was treating with such disdain had argued cases before the state Supreme Court. He had no idea that she didn't just know the law. She had dedicated her life to upholding it, and that included holding men exactly like him accountable. The cold fury that had been a spark in her gut began to glow, a hot, controlled burn beneath her calm exterior. She moved her hand with deliberate slowness toward her purse, feeling the weight of his stare, the palpable tension radiating from him. He was coiled, waiting for a flinch, a sudden move, any excuse to escalate this from a traffic stop into something more. He thought he was hunting, but he was the one who had just walked into the trap. Sarah retrieved her wallet from her purse, her movements economical and precise. She kept her left hand firmly on the steering wheel, a conscious display of compliance. She opened the wallet, extracted her driver's license, and then, with the same unhurried pace, reached over to the glove compartment for the registration and proof of insurance. The entire time she could feel Officer Cutler's eyes boring into her. He wasn't watching for safety, he was watching for weakness. He was assessing her, judging her, fitting her into a preconceived narrative. The expensive but practical leather interior of her car, her professional attire, the child's car seat in the back. He was processing it all through a filter of suspicion. He had pulled her over for a minor infraction, but in his mind, the encounter was already about something much bigger. It was about authority, his authority, and her perceived lack of respect for it. "Here is my license, officer," she said, holding the plastic card out the window. "And here are the vehicle's registration and insurance documents." Cutler didn't take them. He let her hand in the air for a few seconds, a petty power move designed to make her feel foolish. Finally, he snatched the documents from her grasp. His eyes flicked from the license photo to her face, then back again. It was a cursory glance, not the careful check of a diligent officer. He was looking at her, but he wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing a type. "Sarah Jenkins," he read aloud, mispronouncing her last name slightly. "This a nice car for, Sarah. This your vehicle?" The question was laced with insinuation, the pause before her name a deliberate slight. "The registration you are holding confirms that it is," Sarah replied, her tone remaining perfectly neutral, betraying none of the anger simmering within her. "It is registered to me." Cutler leaned against the car, a casual posture that was anything but. It was intimidating, an invasion of her personal space. He tapped a finger on the roof. "So, what do you do for a living, Sarah? Must be a good gig to afford a car like this in this neighborhood." The question was a blatant overreach. It had absolutely no relevance to a traffic stop. It was a fishing expedition. He was profiling her, plain and simple. He saw a woman driving a luxury sedan and his mind jumped to conclusions, all of them unflattering. He was trying to build a case for something, anything, beyond a rolling stop. He was looking for a lie, a hesitation, a crack in her composure that he could exploit. "Officer," Sarah said, her voice dropping a fraction of a degree, acquiring a harder, more precise edge. "My profession is not pertinent to this stop. You have my license and registration. You have yet to inform me why I was pulled over." The directness of her statement seemed to startle him. He was accustomed to people who were either scared and apologetic or belligerently angry. He wasn't used to this calm, unshakable, almost clinical assertion of rights. He pushed himself off the car, his posture stiffening. The mask of casual authority was slipping, revealing the raw ego beneath. "You ran the stop sign back there. he said, his voice clipped. Blew right through it like you owned the road. I disagree with that assessment, officer, Sarah stated. I slowed to a near stop, checked for cross traffic, and proceeded when it was safe. While I may not have come to a full 3-second stop, blowing through it is a gross exaggeration. Oh, it is it? Cutler shot back, a smirk playing on his lips. So now you're going to tell me how to do my job. I'm the one who saw it, my word against yours, and I say you were driving recklessly. Recklessly. The word was a deliberate escalation. A rolling stop was a minor ticket. Reckless driving was a serious misdemeanor, an arrestable offense. He was inventing a crime to justify his hostility. He was building his ladder of escalation, and he was daring her to climb it with him. Sarah took a slow, deep breath. She had seen this exact scenario play out 100 times in dashcam videos she'd reviewed for cases. An officer, challenged on a minor point, feels his authority questioned and doubles down, transforming a routine interaction into a life-altering event for the citizen involved. It was a predictable, dangerous pattern of behavior, and she was seeing it unfold in real time. Officer, she said, choosing her words with surgical care, my vehicle is equipped with a forward-facing event data recorder. It saves footage 30 seconds before and after any sudden deceleration or acceleration. My stop, or lack thereof, is recorded. I can assure you it will not show reckless driving. She was bluffing. Her car had a standard dash cam, but she wasn't certain it had captured the stop sign clearly. It didn't matter. The point was to introduce the idea of objective, third-party evidence, to let him know that this was no longer just his word against hers. A flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps even alarm, crossed Cutler's face before it was replaced by a flush of anger. He had been so certain of his control over the situation. She had just introduced a variable he hadn't expected. A smarter officer would have recognized the trap, cut his losses, written the ticket for the rolling stop, and moved on. But Officer Cutler wasn't a smart officer. He was a proud one. Her challenge to his authority, her calm refusal to be intimidated, had made this personal. He couldn't back down now without losing face. The encounter was no longer about a traffic violation. It was a contest of wills, and he was determined to win. The mention of a data recorder was a direct challenge to Officer Cutler's narrative, a gauntlet thrown down on the asphalt of the quiet residential street. He saw her statement not as a clarification, but as an accusation. She was calling him a liar. His face, already tight with irritation, hardened into a mask of pure belligerence. The psychological dance was over. He had failed to intimidate her with questions and had been fact-checked on his trumped-up accusation. Now he would resort to the bluntest instrument in his arsenal, raw, physical authority. I don't care about your little camera, he snarled, the words sharp and venomous. I know what I saw. I saw a hotshot in a fancy car who thinks she's too important to obey traffic laws. And now I'm seeing a driver with a serious attitude problem who thinks it's a good idea to argue with a police officer. His hand drifted down, resting casually, almost lovingly, on the butt of his holstered firearm. It wasn't a direct threat, not yet, but the message was unmistakable. It was a reminder of the power imbalance, of the violence he was capable of inflicting. Sarah watched the movement, her heart rate ticking up a notch, but her expression remained unchanged. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. I am not arguing, officer, she replied, her voice still infuriatingly level. I am simply stating the facts of the situation. You are making a false accusation, and I am informing you that there is evidence to refute it. That's it, Cutler snapped, his patience completely gone. He took a half step back from the car, creating distance, adopting a tactical stance. I've had enough of your lip. Step out of the vehicle, now! The command was a thunderclap in the quiet morning. It was the point of no return. Sarah's legal mind immediately began dissecting the order. Pennsylvania versus Mims, the Supreme Court case that granted officers the authority to order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. The key word was lawful. This stop had begun on a flimsy pretext, and had now devolved into a personal power trip. The order wasn't for officer safety. She was a lone woman in a business suit, hands in plain sight. It was for humiliation. He wanted to remove her from the sanctuary of her car. He wanted to make her stand on his turf, on the side of the road, where he could tower over her, where she would be vulnerable. He wanted to make an example of her. "For what reason, officer?" Sarah asked, her voice clear and firm, projecting toward his body camera. "There is no safety concern. I am unarmed and I have been fully compliant. There is no legal justification for me to exit my vehicle." "The justification is that I said so," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "You're obstructing my investigation." "What investigation?" she challenged. "The investigation into the rolling stop for which you have no evidence, or the reckless driving charge you just invented?" Every question was a needle, puncturing his inflated sense of authority. He was losing control, and he knew it. Passers-by in other cars were beginning to slow down, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a police officer yelling at a woman in a luxury sedan. A man walking his dog paused on the opposite sidewalk, watching the scene unfold with open concern. The audience was growing, and for Cutler, this only raised the stakes. He couldn't be seen as weak. He couldn't be seen losing an argument to this woman. "Get out of the car or I will remove you myself and add resisting arrest to the charges," he threatened, his hand now unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. This was the moment of decision. Sarah weighed her options in a split second. She could refuse. He would then likely smash her window, drag her out, and charge her with resisting arrest, obstruction, and anything else he could think of. She would eventually be cleared, but not before a traumatic and violent arrest, not before being booked and jailed. Her pristine career would be tarnished by a mugshot, her name dragged through the mud, even if she was ultimately vindicated. Or she could comply, while making it unequivocally clear that she was doing so under protest. She could preserve her physical safety while continuing to build the legal case against him. She chose the latter. She was a prosecutor, not a martyr. Her fight wasn't here on the street, it was in the courtroom, where he was on far less steady ground. "I am exiting the vehicle now," she announced, her voice ringing with formal clarity for the benefit of his camera and any witnesses. "I am doing so under duress, as I fear for my safety if I do not comply with your unlawful order. I do not consent to this action. I do not consent to any searches." She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the car door, and stepped out onto the pavement. The cool morning air felt electric with tension. She stood, smoothing her blazer, and faced him. She was shorter than him by a good 8 inches, but she stood tall, her chin up, her gaze unwavering. She would not be cowed. She looked him directly in the eyes, or rather, at the mirrored lenses that hid them. "What now, officer?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. The world outside the car felt stark and exposed. The sun was brighter. The sounds of the neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, the chatter of birds, seemed unnaturally loud. Sarah stood on the asphalt in her sensible heels, a professional woman on her way to work, now a public spectacle. Officer Cutler seemed to relish the change in venue. On the street, he was in his element. He loomed over her, a physical embodiment of state power. "Turn around," he barked. "Face the car. Hands on the roof." This was pure theater. There was no procedural reason for this. It was a ritual of degradation, a scene he had likely played out many times with people he deemed beneath him. Sarah thought of the legal seminars she had taught to police recruits about de-escalation and constitutional policing. This was the exact opposite of everything she had preached. This was textbook abuse of authority. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her own car. The metal was cool beneath her fingertips. She stared at her faint reflection in the tinted window, her expression a mask of detached composure. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind of activity, no longer just a mother or a driver, but a prosecutor building a case. Every command, every action, every second that passed was being recorded, cataloged, and stored away for the reckoning to come. "Spread your feet," Cutler commanded. When she didn't move fast enough, he used the toe of his polished boot to kick her ankle, forcing her feet further apart. The jolt of the impact shot up her leg. It wasn't painful, but it was deeply insulting, a physical violation meant to assert dominance. "That was unnecessary, officer," she said, her voice tight but controlled, her face still turned toward the car. "I am compliant and unarmed." "I'll decide what's necessary," he grunted behind her. Then she felt his hands on her body. He was conducting a pat-down, a Terry frisk. Her legal mind screamed in protest. A Terry frisk requires reasonable, articulable suspicion that the subject is armed and dangerous. She was a woman in a blazer and slacks. There was no bulge in her clothing, no furtive movements, nothing in her behavior to suggest she was carrying a weapon. This was not a search for safety. It was a non-consensual touching, an assault under the color of law. His hands moved over her sides, her back, down her legs. They were rough, impersonal, and yet intensely violating. He was doing it for show, for the benefit of the growing audience of concerned neighbors. He was punishing her for her defiance, for her refusal to crumble. "You are conducting an illegal search, Officer Cutler," she stated, her voice sharp and clear, bouncing off the glass of her car window. "You have no reasonable suspicion to believe I am armed. Every action you are taking is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. You are acting outside the scope of your duties, and in doing so, are stripping yourself of qualified immunity." The phrase, qualified immunity, hung in the air between them. It was a specific, powerful legal term. It wasn't the vague, "I know my rights" rambling he was used to. It was the language of lawyers, of judges, of the system he was supposed to serve. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation seemed to break through his rage. His hands paused on her back. "What did you just say?" he asked, his tone shifting from pure aggression to mocking curiosity. "You a lawyer or something? Watched a few too many TV shows?" The sneer was back, but it was brittle now. It was the sound of a man trying to convince himself that he was still in control. This was her opening. Not to plead, not to beg, but to warn him, one last time, of the cliff he was about to walk off. She turned her head slightly, enough to look at him over her shoulder. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "Let's just say I have a deep and professional familiarity with the law, officer," she said. "A much deeper familiarity than you are currently demonstrating. I am giving you one final opportunity to de-escalate this situation. You can return my documents, allow me to get back in my car, and we can conclude this unlawful stop. Or you can continue down this path. But I need you to understand, if you choose to continue, the consequences for you will be severe and irreversible." The audacity of her warning, delivered while she was spread-eagled against her own car, was staggering. It should have been a five-alarm fire in his brain, a signal to stop, reassess, and back down. But Cutler's ego was now so invested in winning this confrontation that it blinded him to all reason. He saw her warning not as a lifeline, but as the ultimate act of defiance. In his mind, she wasn't just questioning his authority, she was threatening him. And that was something he could not tolerate. "A threat, huh?" he laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You're threatening an officer? Lady, you have no idea how much trouble you're in." He grabbed her purse from the passenger seat and dumped its contents onto the hood of her car: lipstick, keys, a pack of tissues, and her wallet. He snatched the wallet. "Let's see who you really are." He opened it, his thumbs fumbling past her credit cards and a photo of her late husband. Then he stopped. He had found what he was looking for, but it was not what he expected. The contents of Sarah's wallet lay scattered across the gleaming hood of her car, a mundane collection of a life's necessities. Cutler held the leather wallet as if it were a trophy, the final piece of evidence he needed to confirm his suspicions. He was expecting to find an ordinary ID, perhaps an address that didn't quite match the car, some thread he could pull on to unravel what he believed was a lie. He flipped past the credit cards with a dismissive flick of his thumb. Then his eyes locked onto a small, separate compartment. He pried it open. Inside, nestled against the soft leather, was not one, but two pieces of identification. The first was her standard driver's license, The second was something else entirely. It was a heavy-duty, state-issued ID card. On the left was her photograph, the same professional, no-nonsense expression she wore now. On the right, below the state seal, were words printed in bold, official font. He read them once, then again, his brain struggling to process the information. Sarah M. Jenkins, Senior Deputy State Prosecutor, County of Sterling. Below the title was a small, embossed gold shield, the official crest of the highest law enforcement office in the county. The smug, contemptuous grin that had been plastered on Officer Cutler's face didn't just fade, it evaporated. It was as if a switch had been flipped, cutting power to his entire facade of bravado. The silence that descended was profound. The distant lawnmower seemed to cut out. The birds stopped chirping. In that moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the space between Cutler's wide, disbelieving eyes and the gold-plated ID in his hand. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. His jaw went slack. He looked from the ID card to the back of Sarah's head, then back to the ID. It was like watching a computer trying to run a program that was hopelessly beyond its capacity. His mind was caught in a loop of denial. This couldn't be real. It had to be a fake, a high-quality novelty item. Prosecutors were old, gray-haired men in rumpled suits who he saw at the courthouse. They weren't sharp, composed women in luxury sedans who he pulled over on side streets. His entire worldview, his internal categorization of people, was shattering in real time. But his pride, the very same pride that had led him to this point, made one last, desperate stand. "Nice fake," he scoffed, but the word came out as a weak, strangled croak. The confident bark was gone, replaced by a reedy whisper. He was trying to project disbelief, but all he projected was panic. "You think you can get out of a ticket by impersonating a prosecutor? That's a felony. You just made this a whole lot worse for yourself." Sarah heard the pathetic attempt at bluster. She knew she had him. The trap had been sprung. "It's not fake, Officer Cutler," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. She turned her head slowly, her hands still flat on the roof. She looked him square in the face, seeing past the mirrored sunglasses to the pure, undiluted fear that was now radiating from him. "That is my state-issued credential, and by taking it from my wallet without my permission during an illegal search, you have committed yet another crime. I warned you. I gave you an out. You chose not to take it." The term impersonating a public official was a sword, and he had just tried to use it on the one person in the county who wielded it with the most authority. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He was a beat cop who had just tried to arrest his own boss's boss. He had accused the woman who signs the indictments that send criminals to prison of being a criminal herself. The man walking his dog across the street had stopped and was now openly recording the interaction with his phone. He had seen the whole thing, the aggressive commands, the illegal search, and now this bizarre, frozen tableau. "Hey!" the man shouted, his voice carrying across the street. "Is there a problem over there? That woman is my neighbor. She's a prosecutor." The witness's statement was the final nail in the coffin of Cutler's denial. It was confirmation from a third party. The fantasy that this was all some elaborate bluff by a clever civilian died a swift, brutal death. The blood rushed back to Cutler's face, this time in a hot flush of shame and terror. The world was crashing down around him. His career, his reputation, his future. He could feel it all turning to dust. And in a final, catastrophic act of self-destruction, driven by pure panic and the animal instinct of a cornered creature, he made the worst possible move. He reacted not with reason, but with the momentum of his own failed aggression. "You're under arrest," he stammered, grabbing her arm. The words were automatic, a reflex from a script he could no longer control. For obstruction and impersonating an officer." He pulled her arms behind her back, fumbling for his handcuffs. The metallic click-clack of the ratchet as the steel cuffs closed around Sarah's wrists was the loudest sound on the street. It was the sound of a career ending. It was the sound of Officer Mark Cutler arresting the rule of law itself. The cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs bit into Sarah's wrists. It was a sensation she was intellectually familiar with, but had never personally experienced. She had seen these restraints on thousands of defendants, had heard the sound of their application in countless courtrooms. To feel them on her own skin was a profoundly jarring and dehumanizing experience. For a fleeting second, a wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over her, so intense it made her vision swim. She wanted to scream, to fight, to unleash the fury coiling in her gut, but she crushed it down with the iron will that had defined her entire career. Emotion was a liability. She needed to be cold, sharp, and observant. This was no longer a personal affront. It was evidence. 8:24 a.m., arrested without probable cause. Excessive force applied during handcuffing. Witness intimidation. The prosecutor in her mind was already drafting the indictment. Officer Cutler's grip on her arm was now uncertain, almost trembling. The aggressive certainty he had displayed just moments before had been replaced by a frantic, clumsy panic. He was a man going through the motions, his body acting on training while his mind screamed in horror at the magnitude of his error. "Let's go," he muttered, pulling her toward his patrol car. His voice had lost all its authority. It was thin and reedy. "My vehicle is unlocked with my personal and professional belongings inside," Sarah stated clearly, her voice steady. "My briefcase on the passenger seat contains confidential case files related to an active grand jury investigation. You cannot leave them unsecured." I'll have it towed," Cutler stammered, not looking at her. He was avoiding her eyes, unable to face the woman whose life he had just upended and who now held his own in her hands. "You are not authorized to access those files," Sarah warned, her tone leaving no room for argument. "They are privileged state property. If you or any other officer so much as opens that briefcase, you will be in violation of state and federal law. Do you understand me, officer?" He didn't answer. He fumbled with the handle of his cruiser's back door, the hard plastic door designed for criminals and drunks. He gestured for her to get in. Sarah had to duck her head awkwardly, her cuffed hands making the movement difficult and painful. It was a posture of submission, forced upon her, and she hated it. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality, sealing her in the cage. The back of the cruiser smelled of stale sweat and antiseptic. Through the thick metal grill separating the front and back seats, she watched Cutler. He stood for a moment by her car, seemingly paralyzed by indecision. Then, as if to prove to himself he was still in charge, he walked back to her sedan, opened the driver's door, and slid inside. He wasn't moving it. He was searching it. It was a desperate, illegal hunt for a justification, any justification, for the arrest he had just made. She saw him rummage through her glove box, then reach for her briefcase. Her heart pounded. He opened it. He actually opened it. From her vantage point, she could see him flipping through manila folders marked "Confidential" and "Grand Jury Evidence." He was looking for a gun, for drugs, for anything that would turn her into the criminal he needed her to be. He found nothing but legal documents, subpoenas, and a well-worn copy of the state penal code. With a motion of pure frustration, he threw the briefcase back onto the seat and slammed her car door shut. The search had yielded nothing but more charges against himself. He stomped back to the cruiser, his face a mask of pale, sweating terror. He dropped into the driver's seat, the springs groaning under his weight. He jammed the key in the ignition and roared the engine to life, the sudden noise making Sarah flinch. He still wouldn't look at her. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You have made a catastrophic error, officer," Sarah said from the back seat, her voice calm and measured. "You have the right to remain silent," Cutler recited, the words coming out in a rushed, mechanical monotone. It was a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of control. "I am well aware of my Miranda rights," Sarah shot back. "I am more concerned with yours. You have the right to an attorney and a union representative during your internal affairs interview. I suggest you contact them as soon as possible. You are going to need them." Cutler's only response was to crank the volume on his police radio, filling the car with the crackle of static and the dispassionate voice of the dispatcher. He was trying to drown her out, to create a wall of noise between himself and the reality of his situation. But it was useless. The silence of his own panicked thoughts was surely deafening. He pulled away from the curb with a screech of tires, driving far too fast for the residential street. As they turned the corner, Sarah saw the man who had been filming, her neighbor, still standing on the sidewalk, his phone held high, capturing the entire illegal departure. The evidence was safe. Now, it was time for the reckoning. The 15-minute drive to the 4th precinct felt like an eternity. The car was a pressure cooker of unspoken tension. Officer Cutler drove with a rigid, jerky aggression, his earlier swagger now replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Sarah remained silent in the back, her mind a steel trap, methodically going over every detail of the encounter, every broken law, every violated policy. She was no longer the victim. She was the prosecutor, and this was the most important case of her career. She recognized the route he was taking, the familiar streets leading to the building where she had spent countless hours working with detectives, preparing for trials, and sending criminals to prison. The irony was a bitter pill. She was about to enter her own professional world through the back door in handcuffs. Cutler swerved into the sally port, the secure garage where prisoners were brought in. The heavy, corrugated steel door rumbled shut behind them, plunging the concrete bay into a gloomy, fluorescent-lit twilight. The sound echoed with a grim finality. This was the point of no return. Cutler killed the engine and sat for a full 10 seconds, his head bowed, as if summoning the courage to face what he had done. Finally, he got out and opened her door. "Get out," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. His eyes were fixed on the ground. Sarah swung her legs out and stood, her body stiff from the awkward position. "These handcuffs are cutting off the circulation to my hands, officer," she said, not as a complaint, but as another fact for the record. "Standard procedure," he muttered, the lie sounding hollow even to his own ears. He took her by the arm, but his grip was now shockingly gentle, the hesitant touch of a man handling an unexploded bomb. He led her through a heavy metal door into the precinct's processing area. The air was thick with the familiar smell of industrial-strength coffee, floor polish, and the faint underlying scent of human desperation. It was the smell of her world, but she had never experienced it from this perspective. Behind a high booking desk sat a grizzled, heavy-set officer with a salt-and-pepper mustache and the weary eyes of a man who had seen it all. A nameplate on the desk read Sergeant Miller. Tom Miller was a 20-year veteran, a cop's cop whom Sarah knew and respected. They had worked together on a particularly nasty homicide case 2 years prior. He was by the book, no nonsense, and had zero tolerance for bad policing. "What's this, Cutler?" Miller asked, his eyes still glued to his computer screen. "Couldn't let a soccer mom off with a warning?" "Reckless driving, obstruction, impersonating a public official," Cutler recited, his voice cracking on the last charge. He slapped Sarah's license and the fake ID onto the counter. Claimed she was a prosecutor. Got a real attitude on her. At the mention of prosecutor, Sergeant Miller finally looked up from his screen. His gaze shifted from Cutler to the paperwork, and then to the woman standing in front of him in handcuffs. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. It was as if he had been struck by lightning. His eyes widened in disbelief, his jaw dropping so far his mouth hung open. A styrofoam coffee cup slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk and spilling a dark brown puddle across a stack of papers. He didn't seem to notice. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward against the linoleum floor. The silence in the booking area was suddenly absolute, thick with a gathering dread. Every officer within earshot turned to stare. "Cutler," Miller breathed, his voice a choked whisper. What in God's name have you done?" "She was lying," Cutler said defensively, his voice rising in panic. "The ID has to be fake." "Fake?" Miller roared, his voice exploding in the confined space. He lunged around the counter, his face purple with a mixture of rage and terror. "You monumental idiot! That's Sarah Jenkins! That's the senior deputy state prosecutor!" Cutler stumbled backward as if he'd been physically struck. He stared at Sarah, then at the apoplectic sergeant, his mind finally irrevocably accepting the truth. The world tilted on its axis. Sarah stood tall, her expression unreadable. She looked directly at Sergeant Miller. "Hello, Tom," she said, her voice as cool and sharp as a shard of glass. "I believe Officer Cutler has made a grave professional miscalculation. Could you please have him remove these cuffs?" Miller didn't even look at Cutler. He was already shouting, "Get the keys! Get them off her now!" Cutler's hands were shaking so violently that he couldn't get the key into the lock. He fumbled, dropped the ring of keys which skittered across the floor. "Useless!" Miller bellowed, shoving Cutler aside with such force that the younger officer slammed into the wall. Miller snatched the keys from the floor, unlocked the handcuffs himself, and gently helped Sarah remove them. "Ma'am, Prosecutor Jenkins, I am so sorry," he stammered, his face awash with horror. "I don't know what he was thinking." Sarah rubbed her wrists, angry red welts already forming on her skin. She looked over at Cutler, who seemed to have shrunk against the wall, his face a mask of utter ruin. The infamous blue wall of silence had not just cracked, it had been pulverized into dust. When you attack the one person the entire system relies on to put the bad guys away, you don't have allies. You have a department full of people running for cover. Sergeant Miller was already on his radio. "Captain Rostova, you need to get down to booking, right now, and you'd better bring the chief with you. We have a Code 10 situation, and it's bad." The arrival of Captain Eva Rostova was like a cold front sweeping through the already frigid atmosphere of the booking area. Rostova was a tall, imposing woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a reputation for being as tough as she was fair. She took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, her best sergeant looking apoplectic, one of her junior officers looking like he was about to faint, and the senior deputy state prosecutor rubbing the raw, red marks on her wrists. Rostova's face, normally stern, became a granite mask of fury. "Miller, what happened?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. "He arrested her, Captain," Miller said, gesturing at Cutler with a disgusted wave of his hand. "He arrested Prosecutor Jenkins." Rostova's eyes narrowed to slits. She walked directly up to Sarah, her expression softening with professional concern. "Sarah, are you all right? Do you need a medic?" "I'm physically unharmed, Ava," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "But professionally, I've been profiled, illegally searched, assaulted, and kidnapped by one of your officers." Rostova turned her head slowly, her gaze landing on Cutler with the force of a physical blow. "Cutler, my office, now!" When he didn't move, paralyzed by fear, she screamed, "Now!" The sound echoed through the precinct. "And leave your weapon and your badge on Sergeant Miller's desk." With trembling hands, Cutler unbuckled his duty belt, placing his Glock and badge on the counter as if they were venomous snakes. Without them, he looked smaller, younger, just a man in a uniform who had just incinerated his own life. As he shuffled away like a condemned prisoner, head bowed in shame, the police chief himself arrived, a portly, balding man named Henderson, who looked as if he'd just been woken from a terrible dream. The next few hours were a blur of crisis management. Sarah was escorted to Captain Rostova's office, a sanctuary of calm amidst the storm. She recounted the entire incident, from the rolling stop to the click of the handcuffs, with the dispassionate precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. She didn't need to embellish. The bare facts were a nuclear bomb. The key piece of evidence was the body camera footage. Sergeant Miller had already secured it, treating it like the Zapruder film. In a high-level conference room, Sarah, Captain Rostova, Chief Henderson, and the district attorney, who had rushed to the precinct, watched the video on a large monitor. They saw it all: Cutler's aggression, Sarah's calm compliance, the illegal search, the unlawful arrest. But it was the audio that sealed his fate. As Cutler walked back to his car after first looking at her license, Before he had seen the prosecutor ID, he muttered under his breath, a quiet comment not meant for anyone else's ears. Another silver spoon princess in her German tank thinks she runs the world. The comment, laced with classist resentment and prejudice, erased any possibility that this was a simple mistake or a misunderstanding. It was proof of his bias. It was the motive for his actions. "Well," the district attorney said, breaking the stunned silence in the room, "he's fired. That's non-negotiable." "Firing him isn't enough," Sarah said, her voice cold as steel. "This wasn't just a mistake, this was a pattern. I want his personnel file. I want to see every traffic stop he's ever made, every complaint ever filed against him, because I guarantee you, I am not his first victim. I'm just the first one who could fight back." Sarah was right. The internal investigation, expedited with unprecedented speed, uncovered a deeply disturbing history. Officer Mark Cutler had a complaint history 3 times the department average for excessive force and verbal abuse, all of which had been dismissed by a lenient supervisor. His traffic stop data showed he disproportionately pulled over expensive vehicles and drivers in affluent neighborhoods, often for minor or subjective infractions, leading to a high number of attitude-based arrests for obstruction or resisting. He was a predator who used his badge to bully those he resented. The fallout was swift and brutal. Mark Cutler was terminated from the police force within the week. At Sarah's insistence, the district attorney's office filed criminal charges against him for perjury, for the false statements in his initial report, official oppression, and unlawful restraint. The case was airtight. 6 months later, a jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a stunning and almost unheard-of outcome for an on-duty officer. But Sarah's work was far from over. The audit of Cutler's past cases revealed over a dozen wrongful convictions based solely on his testimony. All were overturned. The city was forced to pay millions in settlements. To avoid a massive civil rights lawsuit from Sarah herself, the city entered into a consent decree, a legally binding agreement to reform the police department. Sarah, working with Captain Rostova, personally helped rewrite the department's policies on traffic stops, use of force, and the citizen complaint process. She used the entirety of her personal settlement from the city to establish the Jenkins Initiative for Police Accountability, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing free legal aid to victims of police misconduct. 1 year later, Sarah stood in a courtroom, preparing to deliver her opening statement in a murder trial. The lead detective on the case, a young man, approached her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect, "just wanted to say, what you did, it changed things around here. It made us better. Thank you." Sarah simply nodded, a small, sad smile on her face. The cost had been high, but the change was real. She had turned the worst morning of her life into a shield for countless others. She had not just upheld the law, she had reforged it. The story of Sarah Jenkins and Mark Cutler serves as a stark reminder of how quickly a position of public trust can be twisted into a weapon of personal prejudice. Cutler's actions didn't spring from a single bad mood. They were the product of a mindset likely festering for years. Psychologically, his behavior points to a deep-seated insecurity, masked by an aggressive, authoritarian personality. He saw a woman in a luxury car not as a fellow citizen, but as a symbol of a world he felt excluded from, triggering a classist bias that overrode his training and his duty. His ego was so fragile that when faced with a calm, intelligent woman who refused to be intimidated, he perceived it as a direct attack on his identity as an authority figure. Instead of de-escalating, he had to win, at any cost. What if Sarah hadn't been a prosecutor? If she had been a doctor, a teacher, or a sales executive, the story would have ended very differently. She would have been arrested, booked, and faced a legal battle that, even if won, would have left permanent scars on her reputation and finances. Her story's triumphant ending hinges on a privilege most citizens don't have. This is the story's most chilling lesson. Justice should not be determined by the ID in your wallet. The best way to protect oneself in such a situation is to do exactly what Sarah did. Remain calm. Clearly state that you are complying under duress and make every statement for the benefit of the recording devices. Do not argue, but do not surrender your rights. Narrate your actions and transform yourself from a participant into an observer, cataloging the events for the battle that will come later, in a courtroom, not on the roadside. The ultimate message of this story is one of accountability. It demonstrates that while the blue wall of silence is a powerful force, it is not unbreakable. It crumbles when confronted with irrefutable evidence and an attack on the very legal system it is sworn to protect. Officer Cutler's punishment was not just about him. It was a message sent throughout the entire department. The systemic changes forced by Sarah's ordeal, the policy rewrites, the accountability initiative, are the true victory. It's a reminder that one person's courage, when applied at the right pressure point, can begin to reform a broken system. It reminds us that we must hold power accountable, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of those who don't have a gold-plated ID to save them. This story was a heavy one, but its conversation is vital. I have two questions for all of you watching. At what exact moment in the story did you feel the tide turn against Officer Cutler? And what systemic changes do you think are most effective in preventing abuses of power like this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps keep these important stories visible. And if you believe in the fight for justice and accountability, please consider subscribing.